Greetings, and thank you for joining us as we begin a group of lectures dealing with matters that have been very much in the news over the last trying several months. As we all have had to deal with what is now being described as the new normal, social distancing, wearing masks, staying home, sometimes when we don't want to stay home, we've seen suddenly new matters and new issues being thrust into the public discourse and being very much part of the news that probably all of us are digesting way too much of. Matters regarding the power of the state and the ability of a governor responsible for ensuring the security of his citizens to make these mandates on the citizenry in their best interests and in the best interests of promoting their health. We've heard where the powers end regarding the individual 50 state governors and where the federal government, the United States government, kicks in. We've seen and heard arguments regarding President Trump having the omnipotent powers to order states to do everything he believes they should regarding this coronavirus challenge. And then at the same time, we've seen the federal government tell the states in many areas, you're on your own regarding ventilators, regarding testing. Where exactly does state power end and federal power begin, or vice versa? We've seen in many states and in many states' capitals citizens gathering in order, number one, to exercise their right of free speech and to peaceably assemble in order to encourage governors to loosen restrictions on movement and to facilitate the reopening of businesses. We've seen, of course, in a number of states where Second Amendment protections enable citizens to open carry firearms. Citizens gathering to argue for the reopening of their state do so carrying automatic weapons, semi-automatic weapons, AR-15s, and weapons of that type. We saw a surreal scene recently where Michigan's state legislature gathered to place votes with members wearing bulletproof vests because protesters with firearms had breached the doors into Michigan's capital in Lansing. We've heard arguments regarding the First Amendment right of religious practice, freedom of religion, and wonder again, do state governors have the ability in times like these to shut down places of worship? And can, in fact, pastors or preachers or rabbis or priests be sanctioned if they flaunt these edicts by state governors and worship and gather anywhere? From Pentecostal, evangelical denominations in the South to Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn, gathering by the hundreds in order to bury one of their fellow members. Where again does the state's power to and responsibility to protect their citizens end and religious freedom begin? Again, lots of weighty, meaty issues that have existed throughout our history but have been driven to the forefront of public attention because of the times in which we are currently living through. And everywhere, we've heard allusions to the founders, to the founding fathers, to the framers of the Constitution. And somehow pundits all across the political and social spectrum have attempted to channel what the framers had in mind as in the period between 1776 and 1791, 15 years, they gathered to write America's three foundational, fundamental founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. So I think that it is very much fitting and proper that today we begin what are going to be 3 separate lectures examining who these founders were. Considering in the late 18th century, in the 1760s, 70s, 80s, 1790s, what were the matters that concerned them most? And thus try to discern what exactly these individuals had in mind then to produce the documents which 250 years later, really a blink of an eye in the thousands of years that people have lived among the earth, but what in the span of 250 years have these rights and freedoms and mandates and separations actually evolved into as we attempt to navigate our way again through these very challenging times. So today we are going to build a timeline which will lead us to Philadelphia in July of 1776 and consider the text and the wording of the Declaration of Independence. Our next lecture will look at the Constitutional Convention and consider again what went into this document that laid the foundation for a federal system of government in the United States, again, sharing powers between the national government, the federal government, and those of the individual states. And then our third lecture in this series will look at all of those freedoms and liberties and consider exactly what the Bill of Rights was intending to accomplish when it was ratified by the states in 1791. And over 220 years or so of evolution and the development of American federal jurisprudence, what all of these rights and liberties have been considered to mean all the way up until the present time. Stuff we learned in elementary school, perhaps, stuff we learned in civics and in high school. If some of us studied these in college, we might have studied these documents even more completely. But I think our presentations are going to cast these documents in the current light of which they are now being alluded to so frequently. So we begin today by a look again at the Declaration of Independence. Now, in order to make our way to this gathering in 1776, a little history is necessary to build us a foundation to talk about the gathering that occurred there. We're big on building foundations, as many of you know. We know that by 1730, after a period of more than 200 years, during which time various expeditions sent by Spain, France, Portugal, the Netherlands, and of course Great Britain had made their way across the Atlantic Ocean, had discovered the great expanse of land that is today the Western Hemisphere, the 2 continents of North America and South America. After lots of settlement, after lots of jockeying, after lots of conflict all around the world, during this really interesting age of exploration and colonization, by the 1730s, Britain had come to possess 13 colonies, which laid along the Atlantic seaboard in what is today, of course, the eastern part of the United States. The British had gained possession of these colonies from various other nations with whom they had competed for control of them. And by the 1730s, and in the decade that followed, these colonies would be very rapidly populated by people who were primarily and overwhelmingly British by birth, later British by ancestry, the population of the colonies, individuals who spoke English, who understood British law, British customs, read British literature, celebrated British holidays, and if they were devout, and most of them were, they were overwhelmingly practitioners of some Western European Protestant Christian religion. Now, during this period of time, in maybe a less understood way, each of these 13 colonies was in the process, or in some cases had already accomplished the goal of removing from their borders the indigenous peoples, the indigenous populations, the Indian populations, whose ancestors, of course, had lived in these areas for millennia prior to the arrival of the Europeans. So by the 1730s and certainly the 1740s, most of the indigenous population had been persuaded by purchase, by treaty, sometimes by war, to pick up and relocate, usually somewhere inland. So by the mid-1700s, by the mid-18th century, these colonies were inhabited by people who were overwhelmingly British, either by birth or by ancestry. We know, of course, however, that there was another large and growing population that we have not yet discussed, and that concerns African slaves and their dependents, who beginning around 1619 began to be traded and eventually sold to those living in the British colonies in America, primarily in colonies where agriculture was the driving force of its commerce. So from Delaware to Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, we would see, of course, in addition to this British birth, British ancestred population, a growing population of enslaved individuals, originally African, eventually, of course, the ancestors of those early African slaves. So Britain's experience in America as the world's greatest colonial power, at a time when it was said the sun never set on the British Empire, was an atypical, unusual, and from the beginning, almost a mutually beneficial one. Because unlike the American experience, Britain's colonial experience in places like India, in Saharan, Middle, and Sub-Saharan Africa, all the way down to South Africa, and other parts of the world, were occasions where a relatively small number of British civil servants, of merchants, of soldiers, had to find a way to control, corral, and compel to do labor the overwhelmingly large populations of those living on the Indian subcontinent, in various places in Africa, and various places all around the world. It was very much, I guess if the word testament is proper, a testament to how the British managed to run their colonies, that a relatively few number of British citizens were able to organize and work and extract and appropriate from these other colonies the great bounty that was being produced, usually for the British to trade all around the world, or maybe in some cases to be traded in Great Britain itself. The American experience was a different one, again because the population was overwhelmingly British in one way or another. And soon we would be able to discern settlement patterns where people coming from certain parts of Great Britain, England or Wales or Scotland or Ireland, would migrate to live in certain of the 13 American colonies. Those coming from farming areas migrating to agricultural colonies, those who were coastal fishermen maybe migrating to a northeastern colony, those who were tradesmen, woodworkers, migrating to the middle Atlantic states where craftsmen were beginning to produce goods of their own. And for the most part, the relationship between Britain and its colonies in America was a mutually beneficial one. The colonies were productive and were able to send usually raw materials or crops into a worldwide British mercantile system of distribution and sale. And these colonists and the colonies were also destinations for finished products or goods coming from elsewhere in the British-dominated world to be sold. All of this, of course, done voluntarily, all of this done among and between people who recognized the British way of production and the British way of trading. Historians looked at this period of time through the early 1700s all the way up to around 1760 and described it as a period of, quote, salutary neglect. The colonists were self-productive. They were capitalists. They were seeking to enrich themselves and therefore did not have to be compelled, nor did the output of their work have to be taken or expropriated by the British because, again, there was a system of trade already in place. Until the fateful years of the mid-1750s, a time in which Great Britain and France began a year-long conflict that historians have called the 7 Years' War, that had a front in North America. We Americans describe this front, this conflict, as the French and Indian War. And it was a time where control of some of the northeastern colonies and some of the most westward parts of those colonies and a large area in the upper Midwest, an area that was then known as the Northwest Territory, which contains today, or would become today, the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan, claimed by the British, were very much under assault and under siege by the French coming down from Canada and a number of allied Indian tribes. So for the very first time during this conflict, the British would have to invest militarily in protecting these colonies and ultimately and implicitly protecting the livelihood of these British ancestored colonists. So beginning around 1754 and extending all the way until the 7 Years' War came to an end by virtue of a treaty signed in Paris in 1763, Britain would have to expend troop strength, sending them over to the colonies to again protect Britain's interests here. These soldiers would have to be paid, they'd have to be housed, they'd have to be clothed, they'd have to be armed. When one of them died on the field of battle in some far-flung area, their loved ones back in Britain would have to be notified. And of course, all of the time that this British troop strength was concentrated in North America, these troops couldn't be off somewhere else around the world trying to grow the size of the British Empire, the realm of the British king at the time, George III. Now, it must be said that colonial militias formed up in every colony from New Hampshire all the way down to Georgia would contribute and fight alongside their better trained British brethren. You may recall in one of our earlier presentations that George Washington would gain a lot of experience as a commander in the Virginia militia fighting in the French and Indian War. It really was, however, a conflict where the superiority of the British Army in North America ultimately led to this victory. So 1763, peace becomes the norm, life returns to normal. Colonial residents and merchants and farmers and those with settlements deeper inland, might have breathed a sigh of relief. A bullet was dodged, the French had been repelled, but interestingly and curiously, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean in Great Britain, the British king, many of his advisors, and the British Parliament looked across the ocean at the colonies in a completely different way. They came to believe that the colonists had been protected and their livelihoods had been ensured by great expenditures of British blood and British treasure. So unlike the past, where the heavy hand of the British military, of the heavy expenditures by the British government had not been necessary to make these colonies productive, all of a sudden, beginning in 1763, there was a feeling expressed in many areas of British government that the colonies collectively owed a debt to the British for the actions taken to protect them. And eventually it was determined, I guess, that a bill was going to be presented collectively to the colonies for the cost of these services rendered. And the British, of course, decided that this bill was going to be collected by the imposition of taxes, the levying of taxes from abroad without any colonial representative voice in how they were levied, what items were taxed, and the amount of tax that was going to be sought. In addition, in 1763, King George III issued what came to be known as the Proclamation of 1763, informing every one of the 13 colonies, many of whom had eyed inland territories as areas of colonial growth. Imagine New York or Pennsylvania growing its western borders through the Great Lakes states into the Midwestern United States. The Proclamation of 1763 told the 13 colonies essentially that your colonies will grow no more in area because all of that Ohio territory, the Northwest Territory, was now the possession of the king, for him to do with it what he chose to do when he chose to do it. Again, viewed by colonial leaders as a very damaging act, restricting potential colonial growth. So we've all heard the stories through the 1760s and into the 1770s, a levying of taxes on a growing number of goods. Essentially, just about anything that colonial residents relied on for their livelihood were eventually subject to a tax. Tea, sugar, tobacco, coffee, paper, lead, glass, all subject to a tax when transactions regarding these goods were conducted. Colonial residents, who by this time, incidentally, had an understanding of representative government. As early as 1619, when the British colonial governor in Virginia permitted Virginia residents, wealthy men who owned land, to establish a legislature, an entity known as the House of Burgesses. By the 1750s, just about every colony had in fact been themselves permitted to establish their own legislature. Representatives were elected by a vote of those usually affluent citizens able to cast votes. And each of these colonial legislatures made law. Most levied and collected taxes that citizens viewed as legitimate, or at least those who paid the taxes viewed as legitimate, because these taxes were levied by a body that had been elected by the individuals who were going to be subject to that tax. So it's fair to say that by the late 1760s and into the 1770s, in every colony, a growing number of citizens recognized the undemocratic, what they might have considered to be the illegitimate way that taxes had been imposed on them from afar without any colonial voice into what might be taxed and how much the taxes might be. So, not surprisingly, these British citizens, or those of British ancestry living in the colonies, recognizing that back in 1730, the British had established an English Bill of Rights, which gave certain rights to English citizens, began peaceably assembling, protesting, usually outside the offices of colonial governors in Providence, in Boston, in Dover, in Philadelphia, the notion of taxation without representation. The protests grew, sometimes violent, sometimes with violent exchanges between colonial protesters and members of the British Army. So, in response to what Parliament and the King viewed as, insolent, ungrateful colonial residents not willing to pay their fair share, the British responded in a couple of ways. One, by the imposition of either coercive or punitive laws, closing ports, seizing goods that the British determined had been acquired by short-circuiting the tax collector, through boycotts, through triangular trade where goods were purchased without the payment of taxes. These punitive laws were intended to punish these actions of tax avoidance, or tax evasion. And coercive laws, again, trying to force colonial residents to comply with the payment of taxes and the maintenance of order. In addition to legislation, we would see during this period of time a growing number of British troops, a growing number of battalions of British soldiers finding their way into colonial capitals and other large cities, usually in the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, the places where most of these protests were beginning and taking place. So inevitably, many colonial leaders who again had argued against the legality or the propriety of these taxes also began to recognize that these colonies were in fact occupied by hostile forces, previously considered maybe their brethren. Now increasingly they were characterized as occupiers of an increasingly hostile mother country, Great Britain. We would see, slowly but surely, a recognition by colonial leaders at least, that what had been the earlier belief that those living in the colonies, British by birth, British by ancestry, were fully empowered British citizens who just happened to live on the other side of the pond from the mother country, was in fact not the case. And they began to recognize themselves as being treated as second-class citizens in now occupied colonies by the British. So by the early 1770s, we would see the formation of so-called committees of correspondence. Leading figures in most of the colonies, individuals who were among the wealthiest, among the best educated, the best read, the best traveled, begin to recognize a great commonality of interest among and between each other, and less of what had been the status quo before, 13 separate connections between 13 separate colonies and Great Britain. You know, a giant umbilical cord of connection between each colony from Georgia through Virginia up to Massachusetts and Great Britain, and less of a commonality of interest among and between each other along the Atlantic seaboard. Through the early 1770s, colonial leaders would in fact recognize that the time was soon approaching where they would have to make, metaphorically, a cut in the ties that connected them as British citizens with the mother country, and a recognition that they were going to rebind their fortunes and their futures to like-minded colonial leaders along the Atlantic seaboard. So through the 1770s, things would accelerate quickly. More and more communication between colonial leaders. A growing British occupation. The imposition of even more punitive, coercive acts. We would see meetings take place in person in places like Annapolis and Williamsburg. Up in Boston, New England colonial leaders would meet, all heading towards what would ultimately be a separation of the colonies from future British control. 2 continental congresses were convened, 1773, a latter one in 1774 and 1775, in order to deal collectively with the challenges that were being posed by Great Britain. Surreptitious meetings again regarding how the king and the parliament might be persuaded to relent, to pull back. The drafting of a number of petitions written on behalf of colonial residents, sent to the king, sent to the parliament, all of them, of course, fruitless. In some cases, greater coercion and punitive actions were the result. As colonial leaders began to contemplate declaring independence, and as early rudimentary colonial militias began to form up, in April of 1775, in 2 little villages outside of Boston, in Lexington and Concord, British troops attempted to detain individuals who they determined to be colonial rabble-rousers in the Boston area. And in April of 1775, when shots were fired between British soldiers and Massachusetts Minutemen, the shots heard around the world would take place more than a year before the actual writing of the Declaration of Independence. So through the remainder of 1775 and into 1776, after a last-ditch olive branch petition had been rejected by the king, colonial leaders began planning for a meeting that they knew would result with a declaration, an assertion by the colonies of their independence from future British control. Now, the challenge was, and once again, look about our neighborhoods, look about our states, look about our cities today, and then see, of course, the great differences of opinion regarding what is the proper conduct of the state and what isn't. What is the proper conduct of the president and the federal government and what isn't? It's fair to say that by early 1776, while colonial leaders had in their mind made the symbolic cut in the connections between themselves and Great Britain, it was also clear that maybe the majority of average colonial residents had not seen the situation so dire and so necessary as for them to have made that cut with the mother country as well. So before actually this gathering in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776 took place, there was an understanding among those delegates who would meet there that a document would have to be produced that would, number one, in a very succinct way, number two, in a very simple way, but also, of course, and here was the challenging part, in an overwhelmingly persuasive way, cause any colonial resident who would read it after it was published, or in some cases would hear it read to them, conclude after being acquainted with the argument made in this document that they too would not only make the cut connecting them across the ocean to the mother country, but if necessary, be ready to take up arms to fight on behalf of their colony. And this collection of colonies, now calling themselves states, against the forces coming from that mother country, Great Britain. The document, of course, we're referring to is the Declaration of Independence. And the record shows that the Declaration of Independence is perhaps the most persuasive, best written pieces of political writing to come out of a period in world history that came to be known as the Age of Enlightenment. It was a time where, primarily in Europe began to pull out of the Dark Ages, began to pull away from a Dark Ages way of thinking, and essentially began to use logic, reasoning, observation to subvert many understandings of science, of medicine, of the order of the stars and the cosmos, and of the nature of governance, and of the nature of the individual and individual rights. The Age of Enlightenment would see many dictates that had frequently been based by the church, largely by the Roman Catholic Church, who decreed the order of the heavens and the stars, who spoke about the human body containing a soul, who often preached the necessity that devout citizens abide by the dictates of hereditary monarchs, and did not address the idea of innate rights, God-given rights, or natural rights as being something that individuals possessed. Individuals like Galileo, pointing a telescope, a rudimentary one, to the stars and concluding that the earth was not the center of those heavenly bodies. Isaac Newton, an incredibly devout British citizen, nonetheless, one day sitting under an apple tree, allegedly, sees an apple fall and wonders, why did it fall down and not up? Begins thinking about gravity and motion. And soon, of course, Newton's 3 laws of motion would be great products of this age of enlightenment. So too, were European thinkers. Great job, if you can get it, by the way, being a thinker. Began considering the nature of hereditary monarchism and whether or not that, in fact, was the proper way for a large population of individuals to be governed. Others began thinking again of individual rights. Were some people born with rights that were so innate, so personal, that no government, no individual should be able to take them away from someone? Were they or were there inalienable such rights? So it must be said that the group that descended upon Philadelphia in the summer of 1776 included a number of the best educated, the smartest, the best read, the best traveled individuals and leaders from these various 13 colonies. Many of them educated in some of the earliest colleges and universities that had been built in the Americas. Many of them educated in even older colleges and universities in Great Britain. And it would fall to these men, and in particular a subcommittee of these men, to produce the document that would justify the conclusion that the colonies now consider themselves to be free and independent states. The Declaration of Independence, history tells us, of course, would very easily meet that initial goal. Colonial residents, men, soldiers, militiamen, overwhelmingly joining the cause for independence. But the Declaration of Independence, as we're soon going to see, would also be very important in that within the Declaration of Independence, many of the theories regarding self-government, democratic republicanism, as well as some of the most basic constitutionally protected individual rights, individual liberties, were alluded to in the Declaration as areas in which the British had disserved their colonial residents. So as we go on later to look at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, I'm going to say a number of times that these two latter documents would become so much stronger and would be so better rooted in the consciousness of Americans, because many of the ideas in the Constitution regarding how Americans would govern themselves and how the powers of the American government would be limited by a declaration in the Bill of Rights, liberties, and freedom, would flow from the pages of the Declaration of Independence itself. And then again, for whatever it's worth, as people began seeking independence and self-determination in the 19th century and the 20th century, all the way into the 21st century, it's amazing how many leaders of independence movements, of movements towards self-government, would remark on how they'd been inspired to pursue their causes by having become familiar with the American Declaration of Independence, a truly inspired, immortal document that can be printed very easily in a rather large font on just 3 pieces of paper, really meeting the test for succinctness in producing, again, an overwhelmingly compelling argument. So the primary author, certainly of the first several drafts of the Declaration of Independence, was Thomas Jefferson. At the time, a 30-some-year-old lawyer from the colony of Virginia, who managed to synthesize and to fuse together so much of the best political theory. The writings of individuals like John Locke, from the Frenchman Montesquieu, the writings of American political philosophers like Thomas Paine and George Mason and John Adams and Ben Franklin, and yes, Thomas Jefferson himself, fusing all of these ideas to lay down an extraordinarily persuasive argument that is the Declaration of Independence. Now, as a lawyer, I've always looked at the Declaration of Independence as a document having 4 separate sections and reading, in many respects, like a divorce petition, sort of making the argument that a marriage was irretrievably broken. In this case, of course, a colonial relationship was irretrievably broken. The result being, of course, each side being able to go their own way, in their own direction. So the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, I believe, is a preamble. It's a statement to the readers of what the document is going to attempt to do. Sort of like the introductory paragraph in any type of legal document, any type of legal filing. Now, the second part of the Declaration, the most important part, the part that we remember most, is the second full paragraph. That is where Jefferson creates what he considers to be a statement regarding the area of universal rights, about the proper nature of government, and of the remedies available to citizens who have been disserved by their government. Sort of in a legal document, a statement of the law that a judge must apply in any particular area. Here are the rules. That's paragraph 2. Now, the third section is the longest. It's the bottom of the first page, all of the second page, and then the top of the third page, all indented, almost, as if Jefferson had had a word processor. These would have been bullet-pointed items that are known collectively as the grievances, sort of like in our analogy with a divorce decree, the grounds. Every one of these grievances individually, and certainly all of them collectively, were intended to prove to a reader that if you believe the rules that were set out in paragraph 2, if you read this laundry lists of grievances, this venting of the colonial spleens, you would only conclude that the rules in paragraph 2 had been broken by a reading of the grievances, leading to the final paragraph, the conclusion of this analysis, of this discourse, where quite naturally, in light of the foregoing, the colonies consider themselves to be free and independent states. Now, very quickly, let's point out some of the highlights, certainly of these first 2 paragraphs. The Declaration starts, of course, with a statement in Congress, Continental Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. Notice that the word united is one begun by a lowercase u, because at the time, the title of the country, the United States of America, was still not decided upon. The nation's name was not set in stone, and instead the word united was intended to convey to a reader, certainly on the Atlantic seaboard, but also the British as well, that this was an endeavor that all 13 colonies were collectively engaged in. A powerful adjective, united. Much better than ambivalent, disinterested, half-hearted. They were united. Now, the first paragraph very respectfully lays out again this preamble. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We're not animals here. This is what we're going to do. Now, something else I forgot that I want to return to. In putting together this document, and as hoping it to be true to the scholarship coming out of the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, in which God could no longer be accounted for why complicated things couldn't be understood. The Dark Ages were noted, of course, for a period of time when anything that was too difficult to understand about the heavens, about the human body, about the nature of how objects moved, any inquiring mind that tried to put forward some theory counter to what the church had explained would often be met with this answer. How do you drive your way out of this response? The reason these things are difficult to understand, they were told, is because God wanted them to be complicated. He wanted them to be mysterious. And, who in the hell are you to try to explain and uncomplicate something that God had meant to be mysterious? So it was a circular reasoning that put thought no more forward. So a good piece of writing from this period of time is one that did not utilize the supernatural, God, to explain, well, we don't understand this because only God knows. That might work in sermons and it might work, in other areas, but in scholarship, that was something that was frowned upon. So we're going to see a couple of occasions where Jefferson, who had written the first drafts of the Declaration of Independence in a way that did not allude to God at all. He was devout, kind of a peculiarly devout guy. He had his own Bible where he took out a lot of the parts that he didn't necessarily think were relevant enough. Jefferson wrote this document initially as a secular one. That's what the Enlightenment seemed to demand. And only later, when a broader group of collaborators began to work with Jefferson, people like John Adams and Ben Franklin, George Mason, and others came along, men who were more devout, but men who also recognized that this document would have to persuade colonial residents who probably, were mostly God-fearing people, that somewhere along the line, they had to believe that somehow what they were doing is within God's plan, is something that God would not frown upon. So, you can imagine, Adams and Franklin reading these first secular drafts and saying, Tom, what's wrong with you? These are all religious people. We've got to somehow allude to God, but not necessarily make this document sink or swim on the belief of, a traditional God up there in heaven. So notice how in this preamble, Jefferson says, equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Sort of a Mother Nature, Mother Earth, not necessarily God up there. We'll see other examples as we make our way on. Now, the second paragraph, the most memorable part of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One of the most immortal pieces of writings in the whole expanse of American history, and I think in the history of Western-style democracy. It's interesting to note that as Jefferson originally wrote the Declaration, it stated, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their birth with certain inalienable rights. So somewhere from the original drafts to the finished product, birth became creator. And again, an allusion, maybe obliquely, to a supreme being smiling on this process, on this project. Now, it goes on to state that to secure these rights, that again, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, these first two sentences, the first, of course, creates the idea of universal rights, inalienable rights. The second creates a belief that proper government is one where those who govern do so only by the consent, the selection of those who are governed. In many respects, again, an outline of some representative form of government. Next, and this is where things become even more dicey, that whenever any government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. People who don't like the government they're stuck with have the right to rise up, remove that government, and make a new government that is going to permit them to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Now, today we live in a time, and for a very long time in the United States, we've lived in a time where all of these are statements that we nod our head and say, of course, universal rights, of course we elect our leaders. And in a way, if we don't like those who lead us today, in the next election, we can go to the polls and vote them out of office. We can change that government. But the fact of the matter was in 1776, there was no government even remotely organized according to these assertions. And certainly there was no self-respecting monarch or hereditary monarch who believed any of this stuff was true. His citizens, the monarch believed, had whatever rights he, the monarch, chose to give him. Universal, innate rights, not understood. The idea that a hereditary monarch serves by the consent of the rabble who are his subjects was again a delusional, ludicrous statement. Most monarchs believed that God had somehow ordained his family line to lead. And the idea that people could rise up and remove a government or a leader they didn't like and put a new one in place, that was outright sedition, that was outright treason, that was the language of revolution. So things we recognize today as fundamental concepts of Western-style democracy in 1776 were highly argumentative and in some cases subversive statements. So part of Jefferson's genius, of course, was to begin this paragraph with words of such great certitude. We hold these truths, not arguments, truths, to be self-evident. I don't even know why I have to say this. Everybody knows. At a time, of course, when these were argumentative and clearly not self-evident, he might have rightly begun this, but he was a good writer, of course, and didn't, by saying, a heck of an argument can be made, or we feel very strongly, and then go on about all men being created equal and so on. But this is the power. This is the powerful language of the document. Now, for whatever it's worth, after talking about people being able to remove a government and replace it with one that would better affect their safety and happiness, he puts on the brakes and sort of puts this back into perspective. He begins by saying next, prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established shall not be changed for light and transient causes. We're not talking about, a revolution every 6 months, heavy stuff. And again, he suggests, and accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. People can take a lot, and it's probably natural that they take a lot before engaging in drastic action. But then he goes back on the attack. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right. Remember, a right is a choice. But then he says it is their duty. Those under a duty to act are obliged to act. It's no longer a choice. It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. You don't believe me? Read these. And what follows, of course, are the following 2/3 of the Declaration, the third section, which lays out point by point by point these grievances, these examples of how, if you believe the rules in the second paragraph, the actions of the king and the parliament have created a justification for colonial residents rising up to declare their independence from that government. And remember, in our next lectures, we're going to look more specifically at these grievances and see how many of them would form the foundation and the basis for the Constitution, creating the type of government and governments that it recognized, and how others of these grievances would find their way directly into the Bill of Rights, an articulation of these important rights, liberties, and freedoms. We go towards the end of the Declaration, and the paragraphs that follow the grievances basically say, we've written the king, we've sent delegations over to the king, we've talked to Parliament, we've tried to work this out in a less dramatic way, but all of these attempts have been beaten back. this is something that is coming only after we tried less hostile means, less dramatic means. And then the next paragraph talks about the average British citizen. They've been informed of the actions of their king and their parliament. They know we all have the same blood. We're all British inside. They know, the average British citizen, of our travails and of our sufferance by the actions of this king. But again, no relief has been brought forward. So the final paragraph, the fourth part of the Declaration, the part of a legal brief that, begins with the word wherefore, and then you ask for a divorce or a separation or custody or whatever. This final paragraph, Jefferson instead begins with, we, therefore, the representatives of the United, lowercase u, States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world, maybe, for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare. And here is the conclusion. One, that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and as free and independent states. Now listen to the powers that are asserted here, because these would be powers that would be given to the national government, the federal government, in the Constitution, among the powers they were given, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. The last paragraph, I believe, is reflective of all of the people who signed this declaration, recognizing that they were putting on the line everything they owned, everything they had, either in the forms of family, in the form of their lives, or in the form of property. And I think it's interesting that nonetheless, following this last sentence, all of the delegates signed up and signed it. John Hancock, of course, said, let me sign that first, and wrote his name real big in case anybody, didn't read well. And here is what the last sentence says. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Once the document was completed, and once it was signed, copies were made and distributed among the colonies so that colonial residents could be quickly brought up to speed by what had been done in their behalf, and so that they could begin the process, if they already had not, of recognizing this new association, formerly colonies, now states, jointly gathering, coming together to win independence for what, of course, would be a new country, a new nation of people, the United States. Now, before we break, I want to tell everyone how thankful I am that you have all, I'm sure, been abiding by the very strict quarantining rules and separation that's been imposed, with your interest in mind by your communities. I'm sure all of you have been very good quarantiners and have all worn your masks when you're supposed to. But I want to let you know, for whatever it's worth, things aren't that much better on the outside. Someone like myself, all of my nest that has been emptied has regathered. And we all are in close quarters, wearing masks, having to go to grocery stores, cook for vegans, deal with, 20, 21, 20-something year old problems. We're wearing our masks, we're following dictates, we're watching way too much news, I think, which can be somewhat depressing. But I am very hopeful, and I look forward to the day when, as we have for a long time, and some of you have known me, for a very long time, we'll be able to resume our live gatherings. But hang in there and stay the course. We certainly are. And sooner, hopefully, rather than later, we'll be able to meet in more intimate surroundings, if I might use that word, very soon. So thank you, and we'll see you all again in a bit. Take care.